It started as these things often do, with a closed-door meeting and a folder. But the truth is, the betrayal began long before that. I'd given TechVantage 17 years of my life. Not just work hours, but life. The kind of quiet, grinding devotion that doesn't make headlines, but builds empires. I wasn't some overnight genius. I didn't drop out of Stanford with a disruptive idea scribbled on the back of a napkin. I was the guy who stayed late after everyone else clocked out. The one who solved the bugs no one else could crack. Who built the foundation one line of code at a time for what would become the company's flagship product. No one noticed when I first joined. Not really. I wasn't flashy. I didn't network well. I wasn't invited to the golf outings or those informal drinks where real decisions were often made. I was just Aaron, head down, focused, reliable. The kind of engineer managers loved because I never caused problems and always delivered. They called me a rock, and for a while I thought that was a compliment. Turns out rocks are meant to be stepped on. The product we built, LedgerCore, wasn't glamorous. It didn't use blockchain or AI or any of the buzzwords that lit up Silicon Valley. It was just stable, fast, scalable. Enterprise-grade accounting software that processed massive data sets in real time without crashing or choking. It worked so well that over 40% of the Fortune 500 ended up using it. What most people didn't know was that LedgerCore was built around a core algorithm I designed on a whiteboard in the back corner of a rented co-working space nearly 2 decades ago, when TechVantage was still just a glorified startup running off angel money and espresso shots. They didn't know because no one told them, certainly not Victor. Victor Lawson, our CEO, was the kind of man who always knew where the cameras were. Tall, sleek, expensive suits and perfect hair that never moved, no matter how animated his stage presence got. He was charisma bottled and carbonated fizzing with a confidence that people mistook for brilliance. But he didn't write a single line of code in his life. He didn't understand how the thing actually worked. What he understood was how to sell it, and sell it he did. At conferences, investor meetings, product launches, he stood on stage and sold LedgerCore like it was the second coming of financial software. He said things like, "We've built the future of enterprise accounting," and people clapped. Investors wrote checks. TechVantage went from a scrappy underdog to a rising juggernaut, all on the back of code he barely understood, and ideas that weren't his. At first I didn't care. I didn't want the spotlight. I was content knowing the engine purred because of what I'd built under the hood. But slowly that indifference hardened into something else. Bitterness, maybe. Or just clarity. Because as the years passed and the company scaled, the people in power stopped seeing me as essential and started seeing me as old. Not obsolete exactly, but inconvenient. I wasn't trendy. I wasn't young or loud or willing to play politics. I was 56. I still preferred meetings with actual agendas. I didn't talk about synergies or value adds. I talked about system architecture and server loads. And in the tech industry, age is a liability no one admits out loud, but everyone calculates behind closed doors. It began subtly. My budget was trimmed. My requests for new hires got held up in HR. Junior engineers I'd mentored were promoted faster past me into roles I'd once quietly assumed would be mine someday. The office moved. I wasn't consulted. My team was restructured. They told me it was to increase cross-functional collaboration. It felt like being dismantled piece by piece. Then came the misfired email. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between calendar invites and Jira updates. I was sipping bad coffee, half skimming threads, when I opened one not meant for me. It had been forwarded by mistake, a long chain discussing succession planning for senior engineers, with my name featured prominently in the discussion. The language was careful, measured. HR always is. They used phrases like phase out legacy position and risk mitigation. One sentence burned itself into my brain. We believe Aaron's institutional knowledge is now more of a bottleneck than an asset. A bottleneck. Not a pillar, not a cornerstone. A problem to be managed. I stared at that thread for a long time. Not because I was shocked they'd been circling for months, but because it was all there typed out like a eulogy written before the death. They weren't just planning to let me go. They were planning to make sure my exit was silent, clean, and unchallenged. The rest of the thread confirmed it. They'd assigned Denise from HR to coordinate the offboarding strategy. There were notes about my severance package, mentions of how to retain key IP rights in case I challenged them later. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it. I just read it 3 times, marked it as unread, and minimized the window. Then I started thinking. You see, what they didn't know, what Victor had never bothered to learn, was that the core of Ledger Core was still mine. Not just in spirit, not just in history. The actual algorithm, the heart of the system, had never been properly patented. I'd flagged the omission years ago when we were still small. Legal had promised to file. They didn't. Later I asked again. Got a vague response. After that, I stopped asking, and I started documenting on my own time, using my own machines. At home on weekends, during nights when sleep wouldn't come, I'd begun refining the original architecture, making it cleaner, faster, more efficient. Every improvement was time-stamped, version-controlled, and backed up to 3 locations. I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't preparing for war, not yet, but I was preparing for survival, just in case. I hadn't told anyone. Not even Miguel, my lead developer and one of the few people I still trusted. It was safer that way. Cleaner. No one could accidentally say something they didn't know. That email changed everything, because now it wasn't just about getting pushed out. It was about being erased. The plan became clear. They were going to restructure me, outclaim the algorithm as company property, and file a patent under TechVantage's name. Strip away my authorship, assign a few internal names to make it look legit, and secure the IP before kicking me to the curb. They'd claim it was joint development. They always do. And if I didn't fight it, history would record them as the creators of the engine I built with my own hands. I couldn't let that happen. But revenge, real revenge, isn't loud. It's not some dramatic courtroom confrontation or a shouting match in the parking lot. Real revenge is slow, surgical, quiet. It's filing the right documents at the right time. It's aligning with the right people behind closed doors. It's building the exit long before they try to push you out. That week I met with a patent attorney, a good one. Referred through a contact I had at Precision Systems, TechVantage's biggest rival. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But I showed him the logs, the improvements, the proof that the new version of the algorithm wasn't part of my employment contract. He took one look and said, "You're sitting on a gold mine." I filed the patent under my own name the following Monday. The next 3 weeks passed like a slow-burning fuse. At the office, nothing changed on the surface. I attended meetings, reviewed pull requests, gave feedback, smiled when spoken to. But beneath it all, I was clearing my desk one item at a time. A photo here, a USB stick there. I backed up my emails, compiled my project documentation, every step calculated, every departure premeditated. Then on a Thursday afternoon it happened. They called me into a conference room with a view of the parking lot. Denise was there. So was Marjorie Thompson Victor's favorite lieutenant, the kind of executive who used words like journey and growth when she meant layoff. She had a folder in her hand and sympathy in her eyes. The corporate kind. They said things like realignment and forward-looking strategy. They told me how much they appreciated my years of service, how hard this decision was, how much they valued me. I listened, nodded, even smiled once or twice. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to, because this wasn't a firing. It was a beginning. Not for them, for me. They thought they were ending my story, but all they'd done was light the first match. I walked out of that room with my head high and a storm brewing in my chest. The hallway outside seemed quieter than usual, the fluorescent lights overhead casting sterile shadows on the polished floor. My reflection followed me in the glass walls, older than I remembered, but not defeated. In my office, I sat for a long moment, hands folded, listening to the distant hum of servers in the data center, one floor down. Somewhere below my algorithm was working quietly, powering transactions worth billions. That wouldn't last much longer. I picked up my phone and sent a single message. "It's done. I'm out Friday." The reply came seconds later. "Perfect. Let's finalize the terms tonight." The text was from Gregory Sullivan, CEO of Precision Systems. By the time I left the office that day, my exit strategy was no longer theoretical. It was operational. And Monday would be unforgettable. Revenge, when done right, doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like control. It feels like building a puzzle in reverse, seeing the final image first, then working backward methodically, patiently, without error. That Thursday night after I walked out of the glass prison, they called a headquarters. I didn't go home. I didn't pace or rage or wallow in what I'd lost. I went to dinner. Meridian was a place you didn't find by accident. Tucked inside a hollowed-out brownstone on a quiet street flanked by trees and an old brick it didn't advertise or post specials online. The only people who ate there were those who were told it existed by someone who already had. There was no signage. Just a discreet call box, a pause and a low click as the door released. Inside the world changed. The air smelled faintly of cedar and saffron, and the lighting was dim, warm like a memory. A hostess guided me wordlessly past low-lit tables occupied by people who whispered rather than talked, nodded rather than gestured. In the back, tucked behind an arched paper screen imported from Kyoto, sat Gregory Sullivan. Greg was TechVantage's most dangerous rival, not because he was louder or richer, but because he was patient. The man understood the market like it was a living organism. Where Victor made bold promises and PR waves, Greg studied. He waited. And when the time was right, he struck like a scalpel, fast, clean, and lethal. We'd met years ago at a cybersecurity summit. Back then, I was still naive enough to believe competitors couldn't be allies. But over time, Greg and I had shared quiet conversations at conferences, passing insights over lukewarm coffee. He always asked smart questions, never too many. And he listened. Actually listened. He respected what I built even if it wasn't his to use. So when I sent the message, "It's done. I'm out Friday," he didn't waste a second. He stood when I approached, offered a firm hand, and we sat. No pretense, no pleasantries. He already knew why I was there. The conversation unfolded slowly over expertly plated courses neither of us really tasted. Greg had already been briefed on the situation. One of his people had noticed that TechVantage never filed a patent for LedgerCore's core algorithm. That alone wouldn't have mattered unless someone else had the right to it. I told him I did. Then I proved it. I pulled out a black leather folio and laid it on the table like an offering. Inside were the documents, development logs, version histories, emails I'd sent to legal years ago, asking about patent status, and the improved architecture I'd built independently outside of company times. Every piece was dated, signed, backed up, and certified. No gaps, no loose threads. A fortress of proof. Greg didn't speak for a long time after flipping through the pages. He didn't need to. I saw it in the shift of his eyes, the recognition, the calculation, then finally the quiet nod. We had an agreement by dessert. Greg's legal team had already drafted licensing documents. Precision Systems would acquire exclusive rights to my improved algorithm. In exchange, I would receive a signing bonus large enough to erase 2 decades of being underpaid equity that would make retirement optional and perhaps, most importantly, a title. Chief Innovation Officer. It wasn't about the prestige. It was about the power to create without interference, to lead without apology, to never again have someone like Victor Lawson call my ideas a team effort while basking in the spotlight. I left Meridian with the documents tucked under one arm and something I hadn't felt in years tightening quietly in my chest. Purpose. The next 2 days moved like a slow-motion ballet. Every gesture mattered. Every move was timed. Friday was my final day at TechVantage. I arrived early before the elevators got crowded with people pretending to like each other. I walked through the lobby one last time, past the digital wall that looped highlight reels of Victor's keynote speeches and splashy product launches. His face looked smug even in still frame. I ignored it. In my office, I began the ritual. Not packing, that would come later. No, I was preparing. Crafting the last impression I would leave behind. Transition documents, project roadmaps, password vaults, access lists. I documented everything, thoroughly, meticulously, and most importantly, politely. I left no room for accusation, no gaps to claim I sabotaged anything. When the fallout began, there'd be no trail leading back to me. At noon, Denise from HR conducted my exit interview. She wore her usual expression, somewhere between sympathy and detachment, the kind they teach you in seminars. She slid a final stack of papers across the table and recited lines she'd said to 100 other employees before me. I smiled. I signed. I handed over my badge, my laptop, my phone, everything they believed would sever my connection to the company. What they didn't understand was that I'd severed that tie weeks ago. There's a peculiar peace that comes when you know the next chapter is already written. By the time I returned to my desk, word had spread. The glances were quick, curious, some sympathetic, most awkward. Junior devs I'd mentored avoided eye contact. A few lingered near the kitchenette waiting for the chance to say something. Good luck, or it's been an honor. I offered nods, faint smiles, nothing more. I didn't want grief or gratitude. I wanted silence. As I placed my final item into the cardboard box, an old ceramic mug with the words "Code Whisperer" printed on it, I heard the footsteps behind me. Marjorie. She leaned on the doorframe with a casualness that reeked of forced comfort. She said something forgettable, about how hard these decisions were, about how Victor valued my contributions. I looked up, held her gaze longer than necessary, and said the words I knew would haunt her later. I start Monday. That shook her. I watched the flicker of confusion bloom into unease. Something in her calculations had gone wrong. They thought I'd leave quietly, that I'd fade. They hadn't counted on Monday. That weekend I signed everything. The licensing agreement, the offer letter, the press release. Greg's team worked through the night to finalize the language. Every clause was a trap laid with surgical precision. The algorithm's name was mine now. Not just legally, but publicly. By 7 a.m. Monday morning, the industry would know the truth. It wasn't Legicor's algorithm. It was my algorithm licensed exclusively to Precision Systems. I spent Sunday evening walking the neighborhood I'd lived in for a decade. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Kids played with chalk. Somewhere nearby, someone grilled chicken. Life continued unaware. I thought about the years I'd given away, the promotions I'd let pass, the times I'd been told to be patient, to be a team player. I thought about every meeting where Victor rephrased my work and passed it off as his own. And I felt nothing. No rage, no regret, only clarity. Monday came, bright, sharp, cold. I wore a charcoal suit not because it looked good, but because it felt like armor. At 7:30, a town car arrived, courtesy of Greg. It smelled of leather and promise. The ride to Precision Systems headquarters was quiet, the city crawling past in slow frames. Skyscrapers, pedestrians, buses, exhaling steam, none of it touched me. At 7:45, I stepped into my new office. It wasn't the corner one, not yet, but it was close. Glass walls, real wood, a door that closed. My name on the frosted panel, Aaron C. Wright, Chief Innovation Officer. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I turned on the screen. Greg had been efficient. The press release was already live. Tech blogs were picking it up. Trade journals were reposting it. By 8:10, one headline made me pause. Precision strikes the mind behind Legicor, finds new home. Underneath was a photo of me from a past panel mid-sentence, my hands gesturing toward a diagram that explained processing nodes. I looked tired in the picture. Smaller, but I was finally visible. At 8:37, my phone buzzed. Miguel. He was still at Tech Vantage, Full-blown panic here. Legal C-suite, even Victor. They're freaking out. I smiled. Check your email, I replied. Because of course they all had offers, waiting every engineer I trusted, every person who'd built LedgerCore with me. Senior positions, better pay. Freedom to work where their ideas weren't just tolerated but sought. By 9:00 a.m., the stock market had opened. TechVantage's shares dipped 2%. By 9:45, internal chaos leaked onto social media. Anonymous posts, rumors, whispers. And at 10:00 a.m., Greg walked into my office and offered a handshake. Well played, he said. I took it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a bottleneck. I felt like the engine. And I was just getting started. There's a peculiar silence that falls the moment you realize you're no longer beholden to a place. It's not the loud, cinematic kind of realization. There's no music swell, no moment of slamming a resignation letter on a table. It's quieter than that. Cleaner. Like stepping out of a room and gently closing the door behind you. Knowing you'll never walk back in, not because you're not allowed, but because you've outgrown it. That Monday morning, while TechVantage scrambled behind their glass curtain, I sat alone in my new office, watching the tremors I'd orchestrated ripple across the industry. It began with a small tech blog post, then a tweet, then a newsletter blast to tens of thousands of subscribers. The moment the announcement broke, the phone lines at Precision Systems lit up. Greg's assistants triaged the press requests while legal began parsing early inquiries from clients, nervously assessing their dependency on LedgerCore. I didn't need to read the emails to know what they were saying. They wanted answers. They wanted licensing clarity. They wanted a roadmap to avoid collapse if TechVantage lost access to the algorithm that powered their accounting infrastructure. I had built something the industry relied on, and now they all knew who really owned it. But it wasn't victory I felt. Not yet. This part, the days that followed, was about execution, not retaliation, strategy, not celebration. There's a difference between vengeance and power. Power doesn't gloat. It calculates. And I still had moves to make. Back at TechVantage, the walls were buckling. Miguel fed me quiet updates throughout the morning. The legal team was already in an emergency huddle, buried in outdated employment contracts and filing cabinets of documentation they should have organized years ago. Victor hadn't shown his face by 10:30, but I imagined him somewhere deep in the building, pacing in tailored panic, his voice raised just a decibel, too high, trying to hide the fact that the floor beneath him was gone. Their entire product, LedgerCore, relied on technology they thought they owned, but it was mine now. Legally, publicly, permanently. I thought back to the moment I signed the patent transfer, the weight of the pen in my hand, the sensation that something long buried had finally come up for air. 17 years of labor quietly taken for granted, reduced to nameless slides in Victor's keynote decks. But not anymore. They couldn't erase me now. By early afternoon, Precision's legal counsel sent the first batch of response letters, professionally worded reminders, that any entity continuing to use the core algorithm without a licensing agreement would be in violation of intellectual property law. It wasn't a threat. It was a notice, a reminder of how the game was played. Not with fury, with precision. The phone on my desk rang again, and this time my new executive assistant picked up her voice calm and clipped. TechVantage had called. 4 times. Victor had called. Twice. Denise from HR had sent an email marked urgent. I told her not to reply. They didn't get to skip to the apology phase just because they finally noticed the fire. They had earned the slow burn. That evening, I sat down with Greg and our general counsel to fine-tune the licensing terms. We kept them just on the edge of fair enough to pass legal scrutiny, but designed to make TechVantage bleed. Triple the standard rate, immediate payment up front, no room for delays, and most important of all, public acknowledgement of me as the sole inventor. We didn't want their money. We wanted the truth. Greg leaned back in his chair as we reviewed the draft, his hands folded across his chest. They'll choke on this, he said, not quite hiding his satisfaction. Good, I replied. Let them taste what they tried to bury. That night I walked home instead of taking the car. I wanted to feel the city beneath my shoes. It was dusk, the buildings glowing in the golden spill of street lamps. I passed restaurants filled with people talking too loudly over overpriced wine, past couples on benches leaning into each other like the world might disappear, past a man who looked like he'd just come from a job interview, his shoulders tense, his breath shallow. I wondered if that had been me years ago. Hungry, hopeful, unseen, but not anymore. By Tuesday morning, the first wave hit. TechVantage's stock dropped 9% before 10 a.m. Not a crash, but a stagger, enough to attract attention. The headlines were unrelenting. TechVantage faces patent crisis. Flagship products future uncertain after key. Inventor defects. CEO Victor Lawson silent amidst licensing turmoil. I could almost hear Victor grinding his teeth from across the city. Miguel told me the mood at HQ was apocalyptic. Developers were whispering in hallways. Sales teams were stalling clients. The PR department had gone dark. Someone wheeled in 3 of the research servers into the legal conference room to scour for proof that the algorithm had been developed on company time. They wouldn't find it, because it wasn't. The improved version, the one I patented, had been coded on my own machines. In my basement, on weekends, on holidays, on nights when I couldn't sleep and the only thing that calmed me was the elegance of an optimized data pipeline. And I had the logs to prove it. Git timestamps, IP logs, hardware signatures. Greg's legal team had audited everything. We were airtight. That afternoon, I received an email from Victor. The subject line, "Let's discuss a solution." I didn't open it. I forwarded it to legal. They replied to him for me. I focused on onboarding my new team, because while TechVantage was spiraling, I was rebuilding. My team's 6 of the sharpest engineers I'd ever worked with had all accepted our offer. They would start the following week. Each of them had a seat at the table. Not just titles, but agency, autonomy, voice. No more being muted by executives who barely understood their own products. Here their names would be on the work, their innovations protected, their value seen. I spent the rest of the day preparing for them, setting up systems, organizing documentation, mapping out the first iteration of our next-gen architecture. The new algorithm would be leaner, smarter, more adaptive. The original was just a prototype compared to what we were about to build. Every improvement I'd held back from TechVantage, every fragment of brilliance I had saved in a private folder labeled Someday, was about to be realized. Someday had arrived. Wednesday came, and with it another update from Miguel. Victor had called an all-hands meeting. He tried to play it cool. A temporary legal misunderstanding, he'd told the team. We're working through it. But the cracks were visible. Engineers asked direct questions. What about the IP? What about the algorithm? Had the company truly failed to file the patent? Victor deflected. Marjorie blanched. Someone asked if they had a backup plan. If Ledger Core could even function without the core algorithm. Victor said yes. Miguel said no one believed him. By Thursday, TechVantage's investor calls turned frantic. 3 major clients reached out to Precision Systems interested in transitioning. They weren't loyal to Victor. They were loyal to stability. And I had just made Precision Systems the new source of that stability. I stayed late that night, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I sat in my glass-walled office as the skyline darkened the city, transforming into 1,000 quiet lights. It reminded me of code's small signals, blinking in rhythm, each one a part of something bigger. There's beauty in building something no one can take from you. By Friday, it was clear TechVantage was bleeding. Their stock had fallen 18% in 5 days. The press was circling like wolves. And Victor, he was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the press briefing. Greg and I would appear together, an intentional show of unity. The story would focus on innovation, growth, future plans. But the subtext would be clear. The real mind behind Ledger Core had found a better home. At the final prep meeting, our PR lead looked at me and said, "You know, we don't need to mention TechVantage at all. The story stands on its own." I nodded. We wouldn't say their name, but they'd feel it. That afternoon, I walked into the boardroom to prepare for the upcoming presentation to our investors. As I connected my laptop to the projector, I caught my reflection in the black screen. I looked older, yes, but I looked honest, and finally whole. This wasn't the climax of the story. This was the threshold. The old chapter had closed, and now it was time to build something no one could ever take from me again. Not out of spite, but out of principle. Because power, real power, isn't taken. It's earned quietly, patiently, deliberately. And now it was mine. There are moments when the world turns without a sound. You expect thunder, maybe an explosion, some grand cinematic rupture to mark the beginning of the end. But in real life, revolution often arrives with a gentle click. An email sent a headline, posted a whisper that moves faster than a scream. The coup began just like that, a whisper. Monday morning. 1 week after I walked out of Tech Vantage with nothing but a cardboard box and everything that mattered. I arrived early at Precision Systems, earlier than usual. The city outside hadn't yet shaken off the cold blue haze of morning, and the building's steel frame was still waking lights, flicking on, floor by floor. I remember pausing in the lobby alone before the motion sensors caught my presence and the elevator hummed to life. There was a strange peace in those few seconds, a moment suspended between before and after. By the time I stepped into my office, the coup was already underway. Greg had timed the press release to drop at 7:00 a.m. sharp. The headline was surgical. Precision Systems secures exclusive rights to industry-leading data architecture. Welcomes inventor Aaron Wright as Chief Innovation Officer. No mention of Tech Vantage. No mention of betrayal. No explicit accusation. Just facts. Cold, inarguable, lethal. The subheadline drove the blade deeper. New appointment positions. Precision Systems to redefine enterprise data processing. Inside the article, the details were immaculate. My background, the newly granted patent, a brief but unambiguous note that I had independently developed the enhanced algorithm outside of my prior employment. It outlined Precision's plan to integrate the architecture across all upcoming products and made it painfully clear anyone wishing to use the technology would now need to license it. The article was picked up by 2 major tech aggregators within the first half hour, then by trade newsletters, then by investor bulletins. By 8:00 a.m. it was trending on LinkedIn. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 8:12 a.m., Miguel sent the first message. Chaos here. Victor just got to the office. GC and CFO were already waiting for him. I could see it in my mind like a film. I'd already watched Victor stepping off the elevator with his usual unearned swagger, only to find the legal team pale-faced, holding printouts of the announcement, stammering about misfiled patents and licensing catastrophes. By 8:30, I received a copy of the internal memo Tech Vantage had sent out to try and calm the storm. Someone had leaked it almost immediately. It was exactly what I expected: evasive language, vague reassurances, and a quiet admission that they were evaluating ongoing IP considerations. No ownership was claimed. No acknowledgement was given. Just enough to say something without saying anything. But it was too late. The industry had already read the real story. By 9:00 a.m., the stock had dropped 4%. By 9:10, clients began calling. Not ours yet. Theirs. Companies that relied on Ledger Core started asking difficult questions. Was their software at risk? Would support continue? Would future updates be affected? Tech Vantage tried to triage, but panic doesn't answer phones. It just spreads. At 9:17, my inbox pinged with a direct message from a CTO I hadn't spoken to in years. Heard you're the new architect at Precision. Any chance we can talk licensing this week? By 9:45, that message had become 12. By 10:15, Greg walked into my office, his face unreadable, a tablet in one hand. He turned the screen to face me. Investor chatter, blog comments, anonymous employees leaking internal screenshots. One post already going viral showed the internal Tech Vantage Slack channel with the quote, "They pushed the guy who built our core engine out the door, and now we're asking if we still own the keys." By 11:00, They were down 7.3%. My phone buzzed again. Victor, email this time. 3 words in the subject line. Let's discuss this. I didn't open it. There was nothing left to discuss. Letting them stew wasn't about cruelty. It was about timing. The mistake they'd made wasn't just betrayal. It was hubris. They thought they could discard me, scrub my name, and claim what I'd built. They assumed I'd go quietly. But now they were learning erasure isn't easy when your name is carved into the machine. By noon, a second wave hit. A respected tech journal released a breakdown of the patent filing. They'd done their homework, interviewed the attorneys, reviewed the timestamps, linked to the original development logs. The verdict was clear. The algorithm at the heart of Ledger Core was developed independently by Aaron Wright and licensed exclusively to Precision Systems. TechVantage's failure to secure the IP could prove to be one of the most costly oversights in recent software history. Costly, not metaphorically, literally. Because every day that passed without a licensing agreement meant risk. Risk to uptime, risk to contracts, risk to valuation, and the market doesn't like risk. By 1:00 p.m., TechVantage's board had called an emergency session. Miguel texted me from the stairwell between meetings. He couldn't risk using company Wi-Fi. Victor's losing it. Marjorie's silent. Legal's trying to shift blame. Half the dev team is updating their LinkedIn. I almost laughed. Not out of spite. Out of disbelief that they hadn't seen this coming. All the signs were there. The silence, the folders, the polite dismissal masked as a restructuring. They'd pushed me off the boat thinking I couldn't swim, but I hadn't drowned. I'd built a bigger ship. By 3:30 p.m., the news had gone mainstream. CNBC ran a segment titled TechVantage's IP Crisis, What You Need to Know. They flashed my face on screen, one of the older conference photos, my expression mid-sentence hands, motioning through an invisible diagram. For a second, I thought about how strange it was to be seen, truly seen. Not as a footnote, not as a team member, but as the architect. That night I stayed in the office later than usual. Not because I had to, because I wanted to watch the fall unfold. Across the city, I imagined Victor at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, combing through contracts he didn't understand, trying to find a line, any line that could save him. There wasn't one. I made sure of that. As the city darkened and the skyline became a constellation of buildings, I sat by the window sipping coffee, watching lights flicker on and off like digital heartbeats. It wasn't just about retribution. It was about balance, correction. Justice not the kind doled out in courtrooms, but the kind you forge with time, patience, and strategy. Justice that doesn't beg to be noticed, but becomes impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, Precision stock had jumped 11%. TechVantage's had dropped 19%. 2 major enterprise clients had quietly reached out asking for a transition plan. They didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. Greg's team handled it all with clean efficiency. Every call, every meeting, every line in every contract, we were writing a new chapter of the industry. And this time, my name was on the cover. Friday afternoon, Greg stopped by with a bottle of whiskey. Not champagne. Whiskey, stronger, slower, wiser. We didn't toast. We didn't need to. We simply sat and watched the storm pass. Outside headlines continued to swirl. Inside I was calm, not triumphant, resolved. Because the coup wasn't about toppling Victor. It was about reclaiming what was mine. And now that I had it, I wasn't letting go. The dust doesn't settle after a storm. Not right away. At first, it just hangs there, thick and heavy in the air, clouding vision, distorting everything. In the days that followed the announcement, that's exactly what the tech world felt like. A low, stunned hum beneath the usual noise. Conversations started quieter, carried longer. Every company watching what happened to TechVantage began asking the question none of them liked asking. What if this happened to us? There's something unnerving about realizing how vulnerable you are. Something electric in watching a giant fall, not with a crash, but a slow, humiliating buckle. Investors don't care how it happens. They just see that it can. The Monday after the press release, I arrived at the Precision Systems campus and the security guard greeted me by name. That hadn't happened the first week. But something had changed. The coup had been unleashed. And now the industry was calculating the damage. Inside, my new assistant met me with a fresh batch of updates, 5 more licensing inquiries, some from companies we'd never heard of, others from well-established names who had quietly relied on modified versions of the original algorithm. A few were panicking. Most were cautious. All of them were looking for lifeboats. Greg had said it over whiskey that Friday this wasn't just about us and Tech Vantage anymore. This was about everyone who had bet their infrastructure on a product built on someone else's invisible labor. They just never imagined that person would come back with a patent. We didn't chase anyone. We didn't gloat. We made the process clean, fair, and scalable. That was the new Precision Systems brand, confidence without cruelty. Meanwhile, Tech Vantage was hemorrhaging. Their board released a statement late Monday evening, a cold apology dressed in legalese. It mentioned unforeseen IP concerns, a strategic realignment, and the all too familiar phrase, "We thank Mr. Wright for his past contributions." Past. I read that sentence twice and smiled at the word they chose. Past. Like my work belonged to another life. Like I wasn't sitting in the executive chair of their biggest competitor, holding the future they once tried to bury. Miguel called that night from a burner. They were preparing for layoffs. Real ones this time. Departments that weren't restructured but gutted. Entire project teams paused indefinitely. Non-essential travel frozen. Clients demanding warranties they could no longer guarantee. Victor had started working from home while the situation stabilizes, but everyone knew what that meant. He was already packing a parachute. By Tuesday morning, Tech Vantage stock had hit a 23% decline from its pre-announcement high. Analysts were calling it the algorithm collapse. Some were even suggesting the company would need to spin off Ledger Core just to survive. Others hinted at acquisition talks. Whispers. That's all it was. But whispers travel far in this industry. Greg pulled me into a war room meeting by midday. A half-dozen execs, some from legal, some from product, all sharp, all watching me as I stepped inside. On the whiteboard, someone had written DFS, plus Equicore, possible converts. We were targeting Tech Vantage's top clients now, not explicitly, just showing them the future, ours. The strategy wasn't conquest, it was inevitability. We outlined a phased migration plan, something our sales team could take to these accounts that didn't scream we're poaching, but instead offered a smooth path toward future-proofing. No pressure, just options laced with survival. The first company to bite was Dataflow Systems, a quiet giant in enterprise resource automation. I remembered them from the early days when Tech Vantage still had to pitch like underdogs. I'd helped close their account once. Now they were closing the door behind us and stepping through mine. Their CTO spoke in measured tones on the call, but I could tell from the way he cleared his throat before asking about licensing tiers that they were already halfway out. That afternoon, I drafted the internal memo for our engineering team. The title was simple, Phase 2 Begins. Inside, I laid out the roadmap, one we'd held off on unveiling until we were absolutely certain we held the field. This wasn't just about porting the algorithm. It was about building on top of it. A platform, a whole ecosystem of modular, scalable proprietary tools that extended the core architecture into machine learning, forecasting, dynamic reporting, all of it designed with the speed and efficiency no one else could replicate because no one else had the blueprint. Only me, and now my team. Miguel came on board officially the following Monday. Along with him, 4 more engineers from the old unit. When they stepped into the new building, I saw something shift in their posture, like someone had finally let them exhale after holding their breath too long. We held the kickoff that afternoon. Not in a conference room, in the lab. Whiteboards, diagrams, old inside jokes between teammates who had once built greatness together and now had the freedom to do it again, this time with their names attached. I gave them the space, No speeches, no directives. Just a nod. They knew what to do. By Wednesday, another article dropped. This one was personal. An editorial piece. Long form, titled "The Man Tech Vantage Forgot." It walked through my career, my years behind the curtain, the architecture I'd built, the credit I'd never received, the patent I finally filed, and the storm that followed. I read it alone that night in my apartment, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the dull buzz of street lamps outside. There was a paragraph toward the end that struck something deeper than I expected. In the rush to scale, companies often forget that innovation is not a department, it's a person. And when you erase the person, you risk erasing the future they would have created for you. I closed the laptop, sat for a long time, thought about everything I had let slide over the years. Every moment I told myself it didn't matter. Every time I convinced myself that being quiet was the same as being noble. It wasn't. There's nothing noble about being erased. Tech Vantage knew that now. By Friday, Victor was gone, not officially terminated. The press release called it a transition, said he was pursuing new opportunities. But the truth bled through the tone. The board had cut him loose to stop the bleeding. Marjorie followed the next week. So did their head of legal. The company entered full crisis mode. Hiring freezes. Investor calls cancelled. Clients skittish. Recruiters from Tech Vantage quietly reached out to Precision Systems. We hired the best ones. No hard feelings, just gravity. That weekend, Greg invited me to a private dinner with a few of the board members. No agenda, just acknowledgement. Not of revenge, of the victory we'd all helped construct. They raised their glasses not to dominance, to foresight. And I realized then how rare it was to be recognized, not just for what you did, but for how far ahead you saw when you did it. When I left that night, the streets were nearly empty. The rain had just stopped, and the pavement shimmered with the reflection of high-rise lights and street signals blinking red to no one. The air was clean, the city silent. For the first time in 17 years, I felt like I wasn't waiting for something to happen. It had happened, and I was still standing. Better, wiser, seen. The industry had changed, because one man decided not to go quietly, because one man remembered that silence doesn't protect you. And now the world knew what I'd known for years. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You just have to be undeniable. Victory doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't knock on your door with a grin and announce itself like some triumphant guest. No real victory arrives slowly, quietly. It seeps into the small spaces of your life, replacing the weight you didn't know you were carrying with something lighter. Not euphoria, not vindication. Peace. It had been 3 months since Tech Vantage's fall began. Since my name returned to the story it had once been scrubbed from. Since I walked out of their building with a box in my hands and steel in my spine. I had expected to feel elation. I thought perhaps there would be a moment of sweet cinematic satisfaction, the camera panning wide, a smirk crossing my face, something final and tidy. But the real moment of victory didn't come in a boardroom. It came in the quiet. It came on a Wednesday morning in a room with no glass walls, no executives, no cameras. Just me, my team, and a whiteboard. We were already filling with sketches for the next iteration of the system. Not because someone asked us to, not because we were racing a deadline, but because we wanted to. Because for the first time in my career, creation wasn't constrained by someone else's ego. That morning, I remember pausing mid-sentence while explaining a node optimization idea to Miguel and just watching him scribble a note. Watching Anita shake her head and offer a better alternative. Watching 4 engineers people who had once been muzzled under another roof toss around billion-dollar ideas with the easy confidence of people who finally knew their worth. That was it. That was the win. Not just that I had survived the betrayal, but that I had made space for others to thrive in the aftermath. Victor's name hadn't appeared in industry news for weeks. After the board forced his resignation, he disappeared from the public eye. Rumors circulated a consulting gig in Asia, a short-term advisory role at a failing startup, maybe nothing at all. He was a man undone not by scandal, but by being unremarkable once the smoke cleared. Marjorie had fared no better. Her fall was quieter, but somehow more hollow. For all her corporate polish, all her carefully worded memos and steely glances in polished conference rooms, she had no legacy, no invention, no product, no team that remembered her fondly. She had been a vessel for someone else's authority, and once that vessel cracked, there was nothing inside. But me, I had moved on, not just up, not just out, forward. Precision Systems was no longer just the company that hired the guy who built LedgerCore. We were becoming something else entirely, the benchmark. The place where innovation wasn't squeezed out of engineers like pulp from a fruit, but drawn up from them like water from a well. We released 2 beta products within 6 months. One of them was already being piloted by 3 Fortune 100 companies. The other was breaking performance benchmarks with numbers our competitors claimed were theoretical. And still, that wasn't the victory either. No, the victory came in moments you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. The handwritten thank you note I got from a junior engineer who had followed my story and found the courage to document her own work just in case she wrote. The way Greg started letting me lead strategy meetings solo, because as he said, once you see farther than the room, the day I walked into my office and found my team had framed the original napkin sketch of the algorithm, the one I drew in that tiny co-working space 17 years ago. They'd tracked it down, preserved it behind glass, hung it beside my door. I used to believe recognition was something you waited for. Now I knew better. Recognition was something you protected. Ownership was something you documented. And legacy. Legacy was what you left in the hands of the people who came after you. The final blow didn't come from me, not directly. It came from a quietly released SEC report almost a year after I left TechVantage. Hidden in the footnotes filed between performance projections and risk statements was a single paragraph confirming what everyone already knew. The LedgerCore algorithm was no longer considered an internal asset. The company had agreed to ongoing licensing terms with Precision Systems, and for the first time in public record, they acknowledged me by name. Aaron Wright, inventor of the distributed architecture used in LedgerCore. I read that line once. Then again, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't forward it to my team or print it out or frame it. I simply sat there staring at it in the soft glow of my monitor and breathed. It was done. Not just the legal battle. Not just the market response. The erasure was undone. They could never take that line back. Not from the filings. Not from the industry. Not from history. The final act came later that summer at the Global Innovation Conference. I hadn't planned to attend. I hadn't even submitted anything. But the organizers reached out personally, asked me to speak. Not about revenge. Not about TechVantage. About innovation. About resilience, about protecting intellectual labor in a world that moves too fast to remember the names of the people who build the bones of everything. I didn't want a spotlight, but I knew what it meant to show up. So I said yes. I stood in front of a crowd of 1,200 that day, people from across the world, engineers, product managers, designers, students with notebooks open and pens ready. And behind me on the screen, the title of my talk. The Cost of Silence, What Happens When We Forget Who Builds. I told them everything, not the legal details, not the gossip, just the truth. What it feels like to pour yourself into something for years and watch someone else carry it across the finish line. What it takes to keep going when you're told you're no longer relevant. How to build a system strong enough that even if they shut you out, the foundation still bears your name. I finished my talk and the applause was thunderous, but that wasn't the part that stayed with me. It was the line after, the one I said without planning to. If you're listening and someone's trying to convince you that your work doesn't matter, document it anyway. One day you might need to remind the world that the engine was always yours. Afterward, in the hallway, a young developer approached me. Nervous, maybe 25. Eyes like I used to have, sharp, hungry, a little uncertain. He told me he was working on something that no one in his company understood. said they smiled and nodded when he spoke, then rephrased his work in simpler terms during meetings. I looked him in the eye and told him what I had told myself so many nights in the dark. Keep your notes. Back up your work. And don't ever believe them when they tell you that genius has a look. It doesn't. It just has receipts. Now every morning I walk into the office and pass that napkin sketch. Some days I touch the glass, just briefly, just enough to feel the weight of time. Some nights I stay late, not because I have to, but because the building is quiet and the work is beautiful and the hum of servers reminds me of the beginning. And every so often I think back to that small beige conference room, the one where Marjorie handed me that folder, where Victor thought he'd seen the last of me, where they miscalculated the cost of forgetting who built the very thing they stood on. They taught me a hard truth, but I turned it into a lesson for everyone else. Never bet against the architect. Not if the walls still stand. Not if the blueprints are still in his hand. Because when the dust settles, when the chairs have emptied and the cameras are gone, the world remembers not who spoke the loudest, but who left the strongest foundation. And mine's still standing.